Snow drifted silently across the ruins of Berchtesgaden as the last American patrol left the mountain road in May 1945. Beneath the splintered timbers of the Kehlsteinhaus, a hidden bunker, its entrance sealed with ice and rubble, was said to contain the Reich's final secrets. Officially, Operation Glacier never existed, yet fragments of orders, burned film reels, and half-erased ledger entries suggest otherwise. A detachment from the US 5th Infantry Division entered those tunnels, led by men who carried no insignia. None returned. What they found, and what was taken from that frozen fortress, would vanish into the classified archives of post-war America. Chapter 1. Operation Glacier. The Disappearance at Kehlsteinhaus. The final weeks of the Third Reich were chaos dressed in snow and silence. By April 25, 1945, the Allied advance had reached the foothills of the Bavarian Alps, pushing into Berchtesgaden, where rumors persisted of secret caches, buried archives, and the final refuge of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. The Kehlsteinhaus, perched nearly 6,000 feet above sea level, was more than a symbolic target. Intelligence reports from London's MI6 suggested that the facility might contain experimental documentation from the Reich's medical and weapons divisions, classified, projects too valuable to leave to the Soviets. Task Force Ida, a composite group of 12 men from the 101st Counterintelligence Corps, was dispatched under direct orders from Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The official orders, signed by Brigadier General William J. Donovan of the OSS, stated the mission as a site evaluation and retrieval operation, but appended to the bottom in black carbon paper was the line, Operation Glacier, Subdirective, biological and environmental files to be secured intact. No officer questioned the vague phrasing. Most had seen stranger things as the Reich collapsed into ruin. The team moved by jeep convoy from Salzburg to Berchtesgaden, arriving amid artillery smoke and scattered resistance. Locals, dazed and starved, spoke of German soldiers fleeing into the mountains, carrying crates marked with black eagles and ice blue insignias, symbols not recognized by standard Wehrmacht divisions. The convoy's lead vehicle carried Lieutenant Samuel Orr, a Harvard-trained pathologist seconded to the intelligence branch for reasons never fully explained. His journal, later recovered from a depot in Rams, records his first impression of the site. Air feels wrong. Everything smells of frost and ammonia. Locals refuse to climb higher. They say the mountain breathes. By evening, the group established a temporary base at the Berghof ruins. According to Corporal Henry Levin's final field report, a civilian guide named Matthias Brenner was recruited to lead them up the switchback path the next morning. Brenner had once worked as a cable engineer for the Reichspost, and he claimed that during the final months of 1944, the SS had reinforced the Kehlsteinhaus's lower tunnels with new ventilation shafts and what he called cryoreomer, cold chambers. Orr's journal notes a conversation overheard between Brenner and a German deserter, who warned that they tried to make men endure the cold, not escape it. The ascent began at dawn on April 26th. Weather records from the period show an unseasonal blizzard striking the region that same day. Radio logs indicate that at 0700 hours, Task Force Ida transmitted a brief message. Visibility low. Proceeding to upper tunnel. Encountered sealed steel door. Will attempt breach. It would be the last confirmed contact. The following entries in the OSS Operations Diary list the mission as ongoing, then status uncertain, and finally, by May 1st, operation terminated. No recovery was ever attempted. Decades later, in 1981, a retired US Army archivist named Helen Givens uncovered a classified index entry labeled Glacier Materials, Biothermal Assets. The file was stored within a Cold War-era medical research folder at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Most of its contents had been shredded under Executive Order 10501, but a surviving memorandum, dated August 1947, referred to successful transference of personnel and assets from Alpine installation to secure Nevada facility. Given's written note in the margin reads, "Personnel, not artifacts?" Cross-referencing wartime personnel lists reveals that every member of Task Force Ida was officially reported as KIA Bavaria, yet no graves exist. Their dog tags were never logged, and next of kin letters were unsigned. When a Congressional Oversight Committee in 1954 briefly reopened missing person cases from the European theatre, Operation Glacier was excluded by name. A confidential attachment to that same report, recently declassified, includes a single typed line, Ida Group absorbed under Project Icebound, further inquiry classified until 2030. Eyewitness accounts add further uncertainty. In 1946, a British war photographer named Edwin Mallory, while documenting post-war ruins near Berchtesgaden, took a photograph of a convoy of unmarked military trucks leaving the Eagle's Nest under American guard. The negative, preserved in his estate, clearly shows frost misting from the trucks, despite ambient temperatures above freezing. Mallory's diary claims one of the tarps briefly slipped, revealing metallic containers with embossed numbers, coordinates rather than serials. When he tried to sell the image to a London newspaper, 2 men from the US Embassy allegedly visited him the following week, offering a government stipend for his silence. Another thread appeared in 1962, when a former German engineer named Otto Feldmann testified during a war crimes investigation in Hamburg. Feldmann had worked for a subsidiary of IG Farben in Munich. Under oath, he mentioned an experimental physiological endurance division, relocated in late 1944 to the Berchtesgaden complex. Their research, he said, concerned biothermal resistance, studies of how the human body could survive sub-zero conditions indefinitely. When asked about Operation Glacier, Feldmann paused and replied, "That name is older than your records. We were told the Americans continued the work. The location itself was never officially sealed." Tourists visiting Kehlsteinhaus in the 1950s noted restricted tunnels and locked steel doors beneath the structure. One visitor, Austrian journalist Karl Weiss, described a gust of frigid air seeping from a vent near the southern foundation, even in midsummer. His unpublished notes, found after his death in 1979, contain coordinates to an area several hundred meters below the main site. Marked simply, Lower Glacier, entry collapsed. Modern geological surveys confirm that beneath the Eagle's Nest lie multiple man-made chambers, now inaccessible due to landslides. German mountain rescue teams who attempted limited exploration in 1992 reported encountering frozen pockets of air unnaturally stable in temperature. The readings, minus 12 degrees Celsius at a depth of only 80 meters, defy local permafrost data. Equipment interference and compass drift forced the expedition to abort. No further attempts have been made since. The US Army's own archives remain evasive. A 2011 Freedom of Information request referencing Operation Glacier was denied on the grounds of ongoing national security relevance. When pressed, a Pentagon spokesperson described it as a logistical code unrelated to field operations. Yet, internal FOIA review logs show the request was forwarded to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which handles legacy biological and radiological research. What was Task Force Ida sent to find? The most convincing theory among independent researchers is that Glacier referred not to a weapon, but to a biological endurance experiment, possibly related to German high-altitude or cold exposure trials. The Kehlsteinhaus's altitude, refrigeration systems, and isolation would have made it ideal for such studies. If records or subjects were discovered, the immediate post-war transfer to US custody fits the broader pattern of Operation Paperclip, in which German scientists were absorbed into American programs. The anomaly is the total disappearance of an entire American unit, something even Paperclip never required. Lieutenant Orr's journal, though fragmented, offers the last human trace of what occurred. His final entry, dated April 26, reads, "Brenner says the door leads to the ice vault. He says they kept them alive in there. I hear breathing in the walls." The page ends mid-sentence, the ink frozen in streaks across the margin, as if the pen itself had gone cold. No one ever confirmed whether the notebook was genuine or part of a post-war fabrication. But the handwriting matches Army medical records. The physical book, like the men who wrote it, has never been publicly displayed. 70 years later, the mountain remains quiet. Beneath its polished stone terraces, the tunnels are sealed with reinforced concrete. Yet each winter, when the temperature drops below freezing, hikers report a faint humming near the south face, something that echoes from deep within the rock, rhythmic and distant, like breath condensing behind steel. Chapter 2. Project Mirror, the Moscow Intercept Files. The first mention of Project Mirror appears in a redacted memorandum from the British Foreign Office, dated 17 October 1952. The document, marked Ukusa Eyes Only, references a joint Anglo-American initiative to simulate and reflect Soviet radio frequencies for long-range collection. The wording was ambiguous, as though the authors were describing a natural phenomenon rather than a military project. Yet a handwritten note in the margin, attributed to a communications officer at GCHQ, makes the intent unmistakable. Mirror is operational, signal duplication confirmed over Murmansk sector. The purpose of Mirror, as later reconstructed by historians, was to anticipate enemy transmissions by manipulating the ionosphere itself. Through directed microwave beams, technicians believed they could reflect existing Soviet signals and retrieve echoes before the original messages were even received on the ground. In practice, it was an attempt to exploit atmospheric latency, to bend time and distance in communication interception. The Americans brought in engineers from Bell Labs. The British contributed radar specialists from Malvern, and the project was headquartered at RAF Fylingdales under the cover name Arctic Weather Observation Group. In theory, the concept should have been harmless, a bold but limited intelligence experiment. But in the winter of 1953, Soviet monitoring stations along the Arctic Circle began reporting something they could not explain. Entire encrypted messages, classified under the GRU's priority codes, were returning as perfect duplicates hours after transmission. The phenomenon was first logged by a technician in Archangel, who described it as messages coming home to roost. The strange reflections were verified by Moscow's Central Communications Bureau and immediately classified under the term Zerkalo, Russian for mirror. According to the testimony of defected KGB communications officer Alexei Voronov, the Kremlin initially assumed it was an Allied recording effort, a form of sophisticated echo interception. But when they attempted to trace the reflected signal, they found it emanated not from British or American installations, but from high-altitude anomalies. Thin bands of microwave interference moving above 60 degrees latitude, beyond the reach of conventional radar. The Soviet Air Defense Force dispatched aircraft to investigate. Pilots reported only faint auroral activity and unexplained static bursts on their radio equipment. One Yak-9 squadron from Olenya Air Base vanished from contact for 18 minutes during one such pursuit. When they reappeared on radar, their instruments had reset to factory calibrations, and their flight clocks lagged 6 minutes behind Moscow time. At this same period, in a basement room beneath the US Embassy in London, a visiting delegation from the Office of Naval Intelligence reviewed intercepted recordings labeled Mirror Returns. The tapes, stored in sealed containers, were said to contain playback of Soviet military orders, identical to messages the Soviets would send days later. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first CIA director, attended one of the briefings and wrote in his diary, "If true, we are hearing tomorrow's war today." No public record of these tapes remains. They were supposedly destroyed in 1959 during an archival purge. From the Soviet side, the investigation intensified. In February 1954, the Ministry of State Security established a task unit under Colonel Viktor Gurev. His assignment was to locate the source of the reflections and identify any foreign transmitter responsible. Gurev was meticulous, methodical, and increasingly paranoid. He requisitioned mobile intercept vans and deployed them in concentric patterns around Moscow, triangulating every anomalous return. Each time the point of origin shifted, sometimes toward the Baltic, other times above Siberia. Gurev's surviving field reports, smuggled to the West decades later, describe his growing unease. "We chase ourselves in circles. The reflection moves as if it knows we are looking." By May of that year, the anomalies had spread across multiple Soviet frequency bands, including those reserved for diplomatic transmissions. Panic reached the Politburo when an intercepted mirror echo carried not a military message, but an internal Kremlin memo that had never been transmitted over radio at all. The text concerned Stalin's autopsy results, information known only to a handful of officials. Gurev's team concluded that either Mirror possessed access to documents never sent electronically, or someone within Moscow was deliberately feeding false intelligence into their own system. Both possibilities were deemed intolerable. Meanwhile, at GCHQ, the project's British coordinators were encountering their own crisis. Field technicians at the Fylingdales Array reported that the Mirror antennas had begun receiving signals before the scheduled test transmissions were initiated. The reflection appeared to anticipate their activity. When they shut down the power grid for maintenance, the signal persisted, broadcasting in the absence of any operating equipment. Internal memos recorded engineers describing ghost pings traveling across the spectrum, frequencies identical to their own, but carrying timestamps 1 hour into the future. The Americans wanted to expand the project. The British wanted it buried. On 12th July 1954, the Soviet Union formally accused NATO of psychological warfare through radio manipulation. The allegation was dismissed publicly as Cold War paranoia. Privately, both sides had lost control of whatever Mirror had become. A British liaison in Washington cabled an urgent message to the Foreign Office. Project unstable. Request termination authorization. That cable never received a response. 3 weeks later, a fire broke out at the Fylingdales installation, destroying the central relay station and killing 2 technicians. The official cause was electrical malfunction, but survivors reported seeing pulses of light in the transmitter dome moments before the explosion. Declassified CIA briefings from 1961 suggest the project continued under new management, rebranded as Operation Looking Glass. The airborne command program designed to maintain strategic communication continuity in case of nuclear war. Several of the same engineers who had worked on Mirror reappeared in that initiative, now focused on signal preservation through reflection redundancy. The technology, while no longer experimental, was never explained. To this day, no technical documentation describing the original Mirror mechanism has surfaced. In 1977, a Soviet defector named Sergei Antonov gave an interview in Vienna claiming that the original Mirror array had not been dismantled but relocated to Greenland under US control. He stated that the array continued to emit periodic signals detectable by amateur radio enthusiasts, though always encoded and impossible to trace. When asked what he believed Mirror actually was, Antonov replied, "A conversation that never ends. We spoke, and something spoke back." Modern researchers who examined atmospheric archives from the 1950s found intermittent bursts of microwave resonance corresponding to both British and Soviet frequencies, suggesting that Mirror may have exploited a natural atmospheric quirk, an unknown reflection layer or resonance band. But the precision of the copied messages implies deliberate human control. Whether that control originated from within the Allied network, or from something more abstract, feedback from a system too complex to predict, remains unknown. The final surviving Mirror-related document in British archives is a transmission log dated 3rd December 1958. The entry notes a received signal matching an obsolete Soviet frequency, bearing the header, "Confirm Project Mirror terminated." Beneath it, a single handwritten note reads, "But who confirmed it?" Chapter 3. The Prague Vault and the Ghost Engineers. In May 1945, as the war in Europe collapsed, Soviet armored divisions rolled into Prague under orders from the First Ukrainian Front. The liberation of the city was chaotic and blood-stained, but amid the fighting, a small NKVD detachment, attached to General Ivan Konev's command, was given a different directive. Their objective was not military surrender, but recovery. Specifically, a sealed underground facility beneath Prague Castle, identified in captured Wehrmacht documents as Technische Abteilung Zeta. The codename appeared only once in German archives, buried in a letter from Krupp's research division to the Reich Ministry of Armaments, dated February 1945. Zeta prototypes require secured relocation. Czech facility optimal for containment. No such prototypes were ever officially listed. By late summer, Soviet engineers discovered a concealed freight elevator beneath the old royal palace, hidden behind reinforced masonry. The structure descended almost 50 meters below the castle foundations into a system of tunnels predating the war. Initial inspection revealed power conduits still active and a ventilation network drawing from a separate generator. Within a week, the area was sealed off by NKVD guards, and all documentation pertaining to it was labeled Soversheno Sekretno, top secret. Locals were told it was a munitions dump. In reality, the Soviets had uncovered something far stranger, a complete laboratory complex built by German engineers during the occupation, equipped with drafting tables, generators, and machinery partially dismantled in haste. According to later Czech intelligence notes recovered in 1991, the facility's walls were lined with diagram sheets, showing complex propulsion schematics labeled oscillator and zeropunkt, Antrieb, translating roughly to rotary, oscillator and 0 point, drive. These terms were unknown in contemporary physics. What caught Soviet attention were the blueprints stamped with company seals from Messerschmitt AG and IG Farben, but with personnel signatures that did not exist in any German industrial record. The individuals were simply listed as Gastingenieur, guest engineer. NKVD officer Alexei Komarov, who oversaw the vault's cataloguing, wrote in his field journal, "The machines were designed by no one who officially lived." Interrogations followed. Surviving German scientists captured in Prague, mostly mid-level technicians, were questioned at length. Several mentioned rumors of a special detachment of engineers transferred to Bohemia in late 1944 under SS protection. The group, allegedly under the command of Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, was said to be working on a classified propulsion experiment unrelated to rocketry. One technician described hearing of rotating mercury and electromagnetic suspensions, terms reminiscent of fringe research later dismissed as pseudoscience. Still, Soviet interest intensified. A second wave of engineers was flown in from Moscow to assess the vault's contents. Among them was physicist Dr. Mikhail Petrovich Ostrovsky, who would later appear on Soviet patent filings describing rotational plasma stabilization systems. Western analysts have long speculated that Ostrovsky's later work was directly derived from material taken from the Prague vault. True depth of the discovery became apparent when NKVD archivists uncovered a lead-lined container sealed with both German and Czech military insignia. Inside were 23 identification cards, each bearing a name, rank, and photograph, all marked deceased. Yet none of the listed deaths appeared in any wartime personnel records. Several of the names match signatures found on the Zeta documents. Komarov's report, now partially declassified, contains a disturbing entry. They were erased before they were buried. The engineers never existed in the first place. That phrase, never existed, would reappear decades later in Soviet research correspondence related to aerospace projects. In November 1946, Czechoslovakia formally handed administrative control of the vault to the Soviet Union under a bilateral scientific exchange agreement. The vault's contents were shipped to the USSR in sealed railcars, escorted by NKVD guards to an undisclosed location believed to be near Novosibirsk. The trains arrived without incident, but when Soviet staff attempted to unload the cargo, they discovered several crates empty. Inventory manifests indicated that the missing items corresponded to the propulsion prototypes. The incident was logged as industrial misplacement. No investigation followed. Years later, in 1952, the first signs of what happened to the engineers surfaced. A series of Soviet aerospace patents, filed under Project Siva 9, contained design blueprints nearly identical to the Prague documents. Yet the patents bore the names of Russian scientists who were either unqualified for such advanced work or deceased by that date. Soviet physicist Lev Kirillov, one of the co-signers, was interviewed shortly before his death in 1984. He admitted that the Prague material had been too advanced to reproduce and that the NKVD had ordered certain names added, posthumously to conceal its foreign origin. When asked who the real designers were, Kirillov replied, "They were the ones who never spoke Russian." By the 1960s, Czechoslovak security services were aware that something significant had been removed from beneath Prague Castle. Their own internal memoranda, declassified after 1989, show repeated requests to the Soviet embassy for access to archived technical materials of historical interest. Each was denied. The last official acknowledgement of the vault's existence was in 1972, when construction workers excavating near Hradčany Square uncovered a sealed steel door buried under concrete. Military police arrived within hours, confiscated photographs, and filled the excavation with fresh cement. The workers were told the site contained unexploded ordnance. In 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Czech government opened portions of its war archives. Within a box labelled Prague, 4546 were several water-damaged blueprints and fragments of correspondence bearing the insignia of the SS, Forschungsgemeinschaft, an obscure research collective dissolved in 1945. The recovered documents contained partial schematics referencing Ionish rotation system and Energiumkehr. Physicists consulted by the Czech Academy of Sciences found the diagrams incomprehensible, but on one of the pages, in faded pencil, was an annotation written in Cyrillic. Complete cycle never achieved. Subjects unstable. The phrase subjects unstable has fueled decades of speculation among historians. Some believe it referred to human experimentation linked to cold endurance tests, others to mechanical instability in propulsion systems. A 2004 forensic analysis of the remaining Prague materials revealed traces of liquid mercury and ceramic composites consistent with early plasma containment experiments. One surviving blueprint bore a signature that, when digitally enhanced, matched a German engineer, presumed dead in 1943. The implication was clear. Someone continued his work under a different identity until the war's end. Modern day. Geophysical scans of the Prague castle substructure reveal at least 2 sealed chambers not recorded on any architectural plan. The Czech government maintains that these are medieval storage tunnels, yet electromagnetic surveys indicate dense metallic objects within, too regular in shape to be natural rock. Local authorities prohibit excavation due to structural instability. Independent researchers who attempted to investigate have reported unmarked security patrols on the premises, even after midnight. The Czech Office for National Heritage denies authorizing such patrols. As for the so-called ghost engineers, their legacy appears only in fragments, anonymous photographs, unsigned reports, and patents filed by men who were never seen in public. Soviet and later Russian aerospace archives continue to redact documents from the Sever-9 series. When declassified indexes were briefly accessible in 1992, entry 912 was labeled simply Zeta Adaptation, Untraceable Authorship. Every reference to human personnel was struck through with black ink. In 2008, a Czech historian named Tomáš Vávra published a private paper suggesting that the vault beneath Prague was not merely a research site, but a containment facility for technology the Germans themselves could not control. He argued that the SS used the Czech site as a holding ground for unstable experiments removed from Peenemünde before the Allied bombings. His conclusion was chilling. The Soviets may not have stolen German technology. They may have inherited a problem the Germans were trying to bury. Today, the lower levels of Prague Castle remain off-limits to the public. Official tours end long before reaching the substructure that once housed Technische Abteilung Zeta. On rare occasions when restoration teams are permitted near the old freight shaft, instruments fail inexplicably. Cameras freeze, compasses spin, and the air grows noticeably colder. When engineers measure the temperature variance, they record a steady drop of 5 degrees Celsius directly above the sealed vault floor, even during summer. Beneath layers of stone and silence, something still breathes the stale air of a war that never officially ended. Chapter 4. The Lisbon Exchange, OSS Shadow Network. By the autumn of 1943, Lisbon was the last neutral port where spies, diplomats, and fugitives crossed paths in the open. The city glittered at night. Casinos, harbour lights, and a hum of whispers under chandeliers. But beneath the civility, every table in every café could be an outpost of the war. It was here, in that twilight between neutrality and betrayal, that the Office of Strategic Services established one of its most elusive operations, the Lisbon Exchange. Officially, the exchange was a financial liaison channel for Allied and Portuguese intelligence coordination. In practice, it was a marketplace of deception. The OSS, using Lisbon's neutrality, traded misinformation directly into the bloodstream of Axis intelligence. British MI6 and the German Abwehr both maintained attachés at the same embassies, sometimes drinking at the same bars. Lisbon became the most dangerous safe haven in Europe. Declassified State Department cables show the Lisbon Exchange's operational start date as October 12, 1943. Its first directive, signed by Colonel William J. Donovan himself, read, "All information flow routed through Lisbon to be subject to redaction, duplication or inversion prior to enemy exposure." In simpler terms, it was a program to deliberately leak falsified Allied intelligence through controlled sources, knowing it would reach Berlin. The success of D-Day's deception 2 years later would rest partly on these games of invisible trade. The network's architecture was built around a single man, OSS Field Officer Michael Wexler, codenamed Azure 1. Born in Chicago to Portuguese parents, fluent in 4 languages, Wexler moved through Lisbon society like a ghost. His cover identity was as a shipping clerk for a Swiss trading firm. Every night, he met with German businessmen, Spanish diplomats, and even Italian journalists, feeding each a slightly different version of the same Allied plan. Each narrative contradicted the others just enough to create confusion. The Germans believed the true invasion target lay in the Balkans. The Italians heard whispers of Gibraltar. The Spanish tipped off Berlin about an Allied build-up near Sardinia. None were true, but all were convincing. What made Lisbon extraordinary was how openly these exchanges occurred. The Café Nicola on Rossio Square became an unofficial ground zero of intelligence barter. OSS courier Helen Montgomery later recalled that Lisbon smelled of ink and treason. She described secret messages tucked in menus, typed in invisible ink between layers of carbon paper. One surviving menu, recovered from the CIA archives decades later, still bears faint impressions of Morse code along its border. The real power of the exchange, however, was in its control of what not to tell. OSS linguists learned to mimic German military phrasing so perfectly that Abwehr analysts trusted the leaks more than their own reports. What began as a propaganda experiment turned into a shadow economy of intelligence. Truth bought and sold like contraband. Wexler's internal memoranda to OSS London show growing concern that controlled disinformation may be outpacing control itself. In early 1944, British intelligence intercepted evidence that the Lisbon exchange had been compromised. A double agent embedded within MI6's Iberian network reported that a courier had gone missing, codename Azure 51. His last known location, the Estação do Rossio, where he was seen boarding a train to Madrid, carrying 2 sealed diplomatic pouches. He never arrived. 3 days later, German radio broadcasts referenced Allied troop movements identical to falsified plans circulated by the exchange weeks earlier. The system was feeding back upon itself. Panicked, OSS London initiated an internal audit. The resulting file, marked Eyes Only, Donovan, concluded that Group Azure may have become partially self-sustaining, agents trading information not for mission objectives, but for money, influence, or survival. Lisbon had turned into an organism that no longer answered to Washington. Its operatives were too deeply embedded, their loyalties impossible to measure. Portuguese secret police records from Salazar's regime provide a grim glimpse of what followed. Between March and June 1944, at least 7 foreign nationals were found dead in Lisbon's docks and alleys, all carrying falsified credentials. The PIDE, the Portuguese political police, listed their possessions as diplomatic paraphernalia. A single note recovered from one of the bodies read simply, "Exchange concluded." American diplomats denied involvement. But in the summer of 1944, Wexler's name vanished from all OSS rosters. After the war, references to the Lisbon exchange disappeared from Allied archives almost completely. The few documents that survived show signs of deliberate alteration. Signatures replaced, dates crossed out. Yet in a 1946 debriefing with the newly formed CIA, former OSS analyst Raymond Carter described a sealed envelope passed through neutral channels containing the names of all surviving Azure agents. Carter stated the envelope was never opened. It was sent directly to Washington and logged under restricted archives. When asked why, he replied, "Someone decided certain ghosts should remain uncounted." By 1948, a mysterious series of diplomatic payments from Washington to Lisbon began appearing in Treasury ledgers. The transactions were labelled repatriation of wartime assets. Portuguese banks later confirmed that much of the money was deposited into accounts registered to deceased individuals, many of whom matched codenames from the exchange. Whether these were real people or merely aliases kept alive through paperwork remains uncertain. In 1963, an American expatriate journalist, Thomas Ellery, published an article in Der Spiegel claiming to have located one of the original Azure operatives, living in Buenos Aires under the name Miguel Vasquez, employed as a cultural attaché for the US Embassy. When Ellery confronted him with photographs from Lisbon, the man reportedly smiled and said, "We all traded something, even our names." 3 weeks later, Ellery was found dead in his apartment, his notes missing. Modern historians trying to reconstruct the exchange face an almost total absence of source material. The OSS files remain classified, and Portuguese archives list entire sections of the wartime records as lost to flood damage. British files referencing Lisbon operations are redacted to the point of blankness. Yet the few surviving fragments tell a consistent story. Lisbon was not just a city of spies. It was the point where truth itself became negotiable currency. In the city today, Café Nicolas still stands, its tables crowded with tourists, unaware that beneath the marble floor lies a sealed sub-cellar uncovered during renovations in 1971. Inside were found half-burned documents, diplomatic seals, and a rusted OSS cipher wheel. Among the debris was a brass nameplate engraved with a single word: exchange. Portuguese authorities sealed the chamber after one inspection, citing safety concerns. The files were transferred to Lisbon's National Archive, where they remain under restricted access. Every so often, an anonymous declassification request surfaces in Washington, always referencing the same subject line: OSS Project, the Lisbon Exchange. Each time, the response is identical. No records responsive to this query. But one internal routing slip, mistakenly released under a FOIA appeal, shows a handwritten annotation beside the Lisbon case number. Files returned to origin, 1952. No one can say what origin means. Some suspect it refers to a vault within the CIA's precursor archives. Others, to the very city where the exchange first thrived. A city that still, in its quiet corners, remembers how to whisper in code. Chapter 5. Operation Stoneveil, the Arctic Convoy Secrets. In January 1945, the Arctic route from Britain to the Soviet Union was a corridor of death. Merchant convoys braved sub-zero winds, U-boat packs, and Luftwaffe patrols to deliver tanks, fuel, and food to Murmansk. Yet among the officially recorded missions, one remains conspicuously absent from naval registries: Operation Stoneveil. It never appeared in Admiralty logs, though fragments of its existence echo across declassified signals traffic and survivor testimony. According to post-war intelligence summaries, Stoneveil was not a supply mission. It was an extraction. The first mention of the operation surfaced in a decrypted Enigma message captured by Bletchley Park in late December 1944. The German Naval Command referred to unusual British convoy activity north of Svalbard and noted the presence of an unmarked freighter without manifest. The message was flagged by British analysts and routed through Section 5, MI6's counterintelligence branch. Within a week, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay had approved a restricted movement order for a small escort group under the Royal Navy's Arctic Command. The convoy's codename was Stoneveil, its declared purpose, weather reconnaissance. What it carried, however, was neither meteorological nor benign. Archival fragments suggest the cargo originated not in Britain but in Norway, specifically from a German research outpost near Tromsø, recently overrun by advancing Norwegian partisans. Among the recovered materials were sealed crates marked with the Reichsadler insignia and the phrase "Nur unter Schutz öffnen," open only under guard. Norwegian resistance radioed Allied command, reporting that the site contained equipment of unknown type, possibly experimental radar or guidance technology. Within 72 hours, the crates were loaded onto a British trawler refitted under naval authority, accompanied by 6 men from Special Operations Executive SOE Unit D12, specialists in technical recovery. Their orders were explicit: deliver the cargo to Murmansk under total radio silence. But during the voyage, the convoy encountered an event still unexplained by modern naval historians. The ship's last verified transmission, intercepted by a Canadian monitoring station at Gander, read only, "Aurora at horizon, static increasing, compasses non-functional." Minutes later, the signal cut off. No distress call, no coordinates, nothing. The vessel was reported lost with all hands. After the war, Soviet naval divers conducted recovery operations in the Barents Sea. Their classified report, later leaked in fragments to Western intelligence, described locating a partially submerged hull matching the dimensions of a British trawler. The deck was torn open as if by internal explosion. Inside, divers found evidence of heat damage inconsistent with conventional munitions, metal warped, not burned. More disturbingly, the cargo hold was empty. Not a single crate remained. The Soviet commander overseeing the dive, Captain Viktor Sidorov, submitted a personal note appended to his official report. Strange magnetic interference persists near wreck. Instruments unreliable. Divers report nausea, disorientation. Recommend discontinuing further descent. The site was quietly abandoned. Soviet authorities sealed the report in 1947 under Defense Ministry classification Level K, reserved for incidents involving unidentified scientific anomalies. It remained buried until the early 1990s, when a fragment surfaced in a Russian naval archive during declassification efforts. Western analysts nicknamed it the Murmansk Ghost. Evidence later emerged that the British Admiralty had known of the wreck all along. In 1953, an internal memorandum between naval intelligence officers referenced previous Stoneveil engagement data. The memo's margin contained a scrawled annotation: Compartment 9 remains unrecoverable, containment priority. Containment of what exactly was never specified. However, an attached chart showed the coordinates of a prohibited maritime zone in the Barents Sea, designated Z13. No official vessel lists Z13 as a navigation hazard, yet Royal Navy archives reveal periodic patrol orders to maintain distance, no sonar mapping. Declassified OSS files from the same period provide a chilling parallel. A 1945 cable from Lisbon, the same network once tied to Project Mirror, mentions a northern consignment redirected for Soviet custody under Agreement Stoneveil. The cable implies that the cargo, whatever its nature, was shared with the USSR under conditions of secrecy even higher than those governing atomic research. American analysts speculated it was advanced radar or magnetic propulsion technology derived from captured German work. Yet others noted an inconsistency. The Germans had no known research facilities that far north, nor any record of deployments resembling the devices described. In 1961, Soviet Arctic trawlers reported a series of unexplained compass anomalies near the old Stoneveil coordinates. Crews described sudden surges in magnetic fields, enough to disable navigation systems. One captain compared it to a needle dancing in circles. Shortly after, Soviet military aircraft conducted a low-altitude flyover of the region, followed by the imposition of a permanent civilian exclusion zone. Western observers suspected the Soviets had found remnants of the lost cargo. If so, they never admitted it. British naval historian Dr. Lawrence Atwell spent 15 years piecing together the operation's fragments from Royal Navy files, SOE dispatches, and intercepted German communications. His 1989 monograph, The Silent Convoy, concluded that Operation Stoneveil's objective was the retrieval of an experimental German power source, a compact magnetic containment unit. Atwell cited eyewitness testimony from a retired Norwegian partisan, Erik Dahl, who claimed to have seen one of the crates opened briefly before shipment. Inside, he said, was a metallic sphere that hummed like a hive of bees. Dahl later recanted his statement, insisting he'd been misquoted. He died 6 months after his interview. Following Atwell's publication, the British Ministry of Defence issued a rare statement denying the existence of Operation Stoneveil. Yet internal FOIA requests submitted by researchers were rejected not on the basis of absence, but under Section 3.4 of the Official Secrets Act, materials still relevant to national defence. The classification was renewed in 2010. Some believe this suggests the cargo, or its derivatives, may still be in use, possibly in classified propulsion research under the Ministry's Defence Science and Technology. Laboratory.satellite imagery of the Barents region has since revealed unusual activity in the Z13 exclusion zone. Beginning in 2007, Russian naval vessels began maintaining a semi-permanent presence, rotating every 6 months. Heat signatures indicate underwater construction, possibly a containment platform or monitoring station. When questioned, the Russian Ministry of Defense described the activity as environmental monitoring. Western analysts remain skeptical. In 2018, a Norwegian Coast Guard patrol recorded a low-frequency hum emanating from the area, consistent with electromagnetic oscillation patterns. The sound lasted nearly 7 hours. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence, however, emerged from an unexpected source. In 1979, a declassified CIA signal intercept recorded a Soviet transmission describing activation of recovered unit, energy discharge observed, personnel affected. The message was time-stamped near the coordinates of the Stoneveil wreck. Its final line, partially garbled by interference, read, repeat cycle approaching threshold, abort sequence. No further transmissions followed. To this day, The waters north of Svalbard remain treacherous and tightly monitored. Satellite mapping still shows faint geometric anomalies beneath the sea floor, regular shapes arranged like a honeycomb, metallic echoes under layers of sediment. The region's magnetic field fluctuates unpredictably, forcing navigational systems to reroute around it. Locals call it the sleeping sea. Maritime tradition holds that when the aurora brightens over those waters, radios pick up whispers, distorted Morse code pulses repeating the same phrase over and over. Return secured. Veil intact. Perhaps it's nothing more than Arctic folklore born from decades of secrecy. But every now and then, a fishing trawler reports strange lights beneath the ice, moving slowly against the current, like something dormant, still pulsing with the power of a forgotten war. Operation Stoneveil remains unacknowledged, its cargo unaccounted for, and its silence protected by the deepest veil of all, the cold. Across the fading archives of war, threads connect through static and secrecy. Munich's vanished files, Moscow's intercepted signals, Prague's buried vault, Lisbon's invisible exchange, and the Arctic's sleeping sea. Each file points not to victory or defeat, but to the shadows where truth was engineered and erased. The war may have ended in 1945, yet its echoes continue to hum beneath concrete, behind locked doors and under polar ice. Somewhere, the last pieces of those buried operations remain sealed, not forgotten, only waiting for someone reckless enough to listen to what history was never meant to repeat.